They told me the Durnham house was nothing more than a relic of a forgotten family, a decaying structure swallowed by vines and silence. Yet, when I crossed its threshold, I felt the air change, as if something old and heavy pressed against my chest. The kind of weight that does not belong to the living the locals spoke of, whispers seeping through the cracks of its walls. Voices that rose at night like the sound of someone trapped in a coffin beneath the earth for 93 years. The Durnham family guarded a secret. They built the house as a tomb, a monument to everything they could not bury in the ground. And they thought if they sealed it deep enough, it would never come back into the light. But there is a rule in this world that cannot be broken, no matter how powerful the family, no matter how careful the cover-up. What is hidden will one day demand to be seen. It is the hunger of truth clawing against its own confinement. And when I touched the warped wood of that house, I knew I was about to open something that had been screaming in silence for generations. The Durnhams were not just another southern dynasty of wealth and cruelty. They were architects of fear, shaping their children into vessels, not of love, but of obedience. They believed themselves chosen to preserve an ancient bloodline, a curse wrapped in ritual that required walls, not for protection, but for imprisonment. These walls were fed like an altar, bricked with memory, soaked in secrecy, and fortified with lies. As I walked deeper, the floor moaned beneath me. The dust swirled like ash, and I understood why the heirs avoided this place, why they signed it away for pennies, why their eyes never lingered on the shadows behind me. They were not selling a house. They were discarding a burden. They were paid to forget the voices, the rituals, the hunger sealed behind plaster. Every family carries shame, but this was not shame. This was devotion to something older and darker. A covenant, written not in ink, but in blood and silence. The kind of silence that rots the mind until generations collapse under its weight. You were never meant to hear these words. You were never meant to step through this door. Yet you are here, and once you hear the truth of the Durnhams, you will never walk back into the light the same. The walls breathe, and they remember. And tonight, they are opening for us. The first clue revealed itself not in what I saw, but in what I heard, a low vibration running along the bones of the house, like the steady hum of something alive. Hidden within the timber, the Durnhams had crafted their home like a body with arteries and lungs, with chambers designed not for comfort, but for containment. They had turned the structure into a prison that looked like a home, and in doing so, they tricked the world into believing their cruelty was nothing more than wealth and dignity. I moved carefully along the corridor, where portraits of stern faces lined the walls. Every Durnham patriarch, every matriarch staring down, with eyes that seemed to accuse me for trespassing. Yet beneath the peeling canvas, I swore I heard whispers, as if the paint itself carried voices locked inside. Staring too long made my stomach twist, for it felt less like a gallery and more like a roll call of wardens, each one complicit, each one ensuring the secret stayed bricked in silence. It was in the parlor that I first noticed the shift. The fireplace blackened, as though it had been burned too many times, too hot, too often. The air there was colder, not the natural chill of abandonment, but a sharp bite like a warning as I pressed my hand to the mantel. The bricks beneath trembled faintly, as though something tapped back from the other side. The Durnham records had long been destroyed, the family history erased from official archives. Yet people whispered that the family carried rituals imported from across the ocean. Rites of control. Rites of sacrifice. Rites that fed something within the bloodline itself. I began to see the house not as a ruin, but as a temple, where each room was another verse in their hymn of secrecy. The longer I stayed, the more the silence revealed itself. The house had a language, a rhythm, the creak of boards, the flutter of curtains with no wind, the faint scratching in the walls, not of rats, but of nails, dragging slowly, desperate to escape. Once you tune yourself to its voice, you cannot shut it out. You cannot walk away without carrying a piece of it inside you. The Durnhams were not protecting their legacy, they were binding it. They were locking away the screams of their own bloodline, for what they feared most was not the judgment of the world, but the judgment of the thing they served. The thing they trapped within their walls for 93 years, waiting for someone foolish enough to listen. The deeper I went into the house, the more I realized the Durnhams had designed every corridor as a passage not for the living, but for the forgotten. The air grew heavier, carrying the taste of iron and dust, and something faintly sweet, like rotted fruit, behind the wood panels. There was motion, subtle but certain, as if the walls themselves were breathing their rhythm, uneven, like lungs that belonged to a body far older than the house itself. In the dining hall, a long table still stood, draped in a cloth that had turned the color of old bone. Each chair pushed neatly into place, as though a meal was about to be served. Yet the plates bore no dust, and the silverware gleamed faintly, even in the dim light. It was as though time had stopped in this room, frozen in obedience to something watching unseen. At the head of the table, the master's chair towered larger than the rest, carved with symbols. Half familiar, half impossible shapes that seemed to warp the longer you stared. I leaned closer to study them, and felt a wave rise inside me. Not fear, but pressure, like something pressing against my skull, forcing me to step back. My vision blurred, just long enough to see shadows standing at each seat of the table. Thin silhouettes waiting silently for the feast that had never ended. I blinked, and they were gone. Yet the air still hummed with their presence. It struck me then the house was not abandoned. It had been sealed deliberately, like a tomb. The Durnhams had not left it behind. They had locked it from within, ensuring their pact, their burden, would not spill into the open world. The walls held more than bones. They held a covenant, an unbroken agreement that demanded silence and sacrifice. As I turned to leave the hall, a door creaked open, without touch, revealing a narrow stair that led down into darkness. The boards groaned underfoot, as though begging me not to descend, but something stronger than fear pulled me downward step by step, like an unseen hand, guiding me into the marrow of the house, and into the truth the Durnhams tried to bury. Every house holds its history, but this one was different. It was not a story of the past. It was a command, still alive, still binding every soul who dared to enter. And I realized too late that by stepping deeper, I was no longer a visitor. I was a witness, and witnesses are never allowed to leave. The stairwell was carved, not like a servant's passage, but like a wound cut into the body of the house, each step more uneven than the last. As if the builders had been in a frenzy, working not with precision, but with desperation. The air grew colder. The moment I passed the third step, a sharp drop that felt unnatural, not like a draft, but like stepping into the lungs of something that should not breathe. The lantern in my hand flickered, though there was no wind, and the shadows stretched longer than the space around them, bending against the walls, like roots reaching toward me. I counted the steps under my breath to anchor myself, but the numbers slipped away. They refused to hold, as though the descent itself wanted me to lose track, to forget how far I had fallen. At the bottom, the air changed again, thick, almost liquid, a silence so complete it pressed against my ears, until I swore I could hear the pulse of the house itself. And then the corridor appeared, long, narrow, lined with bricks, the color of dried blood, each brick etched with markings, not decorative, but ritualistic, scratched deep into the surface by hands that had bled for their craft. I touched one, and instantly withdrew. The stone burned cold, searing into my fingertips, leaving the sensation that something had marked me back. The corridor seemed endless, but at its end, a door stood waiting, not of wood but of iron, blackened by fire, warped at the edges as though something behind it had tried to force its way out, or perhaps force its way in. I felt the weight of every Durnham that had lived and died, pressing against that door, whispering in silence to leave it closed. But curiosity is the oldest curse. It gnaws at reason. It turns fear into hunger, and hunger into surrender. I placed my hand upon the iron, and it moved with a groan, not resisting but inviting, as though it had waited for me. Not anyone else, only me. The smell that poured out was sweet and rancid, like fruit left to rot beneath the sun, mixed with the unmistakable stench of decay. And beneath it, something sharper, almost metallic, as though blood had seeped into the very stone. The chamber beyond was not built for comfort, nor for storage. It was built for devotion, the kind of devotion that binds not to gods of light, but to whatever listens from the dark. When I stepped inside, I knew this was not a basement. This was an altar, and the walls were not walls at all. They were shrines filled with the remnants of offerings, sealed in plaster, hidden in silence, waiting for a witness foolish enough to look closer. The chamber opened like a throat swallowing me whole, and the deeper I looked, the more I realized the walls themselves were alive with memory. The plaster was cracked in long vertical lines, and inside each fracture something had been pressed, something sealed and forgotten, yet not gone. The lantern flame shook, not from my hand, but from the air itself, as though unseen breath moved with me. I leaned closer to one of the cracks, and what stared back was not stone, but skin mummified and stretched beneath the surface, fingers curled and twisted as if clawing for release. Eyes empty hollows that still seemed to follow the movement of the flame. Every fragment of the wall was a body or a piece of one, not laid to rest, but entombed, standing upright, encased like relics meant to suffer forever. These were not the honored dead they were. Sacrifices, bodies bound not by accident but by intent, their mouths stuffed with earth, their limbs folded at grotesque angles, then pressed behind fresh plaster until the walls themselves became the Durnham family scripture. Every room above, every hallway, every echo of laughter or sorrow had been built on bones and silence. The deeper I moved into the chamber, the more the offerings changed. The bodies gave way to objects, relics, and artifacts carved with symbols that made no sense, yet pulsed with a familiarity buried in the oldest parts of the human mind. Shards of mirrors blackened with soot, dolls sewn with human hair, jars of fluid holding things that were once alive, but twisted beyond recognition. None of it arranged for beauty, all of it arranged for power. The Durnhams had not hidden wealth. They had hidden devotion, the kind that demanded more than faith. It demanded flesh and secrecy. It demanded that every generation carve deeper into the darkness to prove their loyalty, not to God, not to country, but to something nameless, something that demanded silence in exchange for survival. And then I found it the centerpiece of the room, a slab of stone cut in a shape not geometric but organic, almost like bone, a slab stained with layers of crimson so deep that it had turned black with time above it. The wall was carved with one phrase over and over, in letters jagged and violent, as though etched by desperate hands. The phrase was not English, not Latin, but something older, a language designed not to be spoken, but to be felt. As I stared at it, the silence grew heavier, and I realized the truth. The Durnham house was never a home. It was a covenant, a pact sealed not with ink, but with what the walls themselves had swallowed. The slab stood before me like an altar, and every instinct screamed to turn back. But the deeper I stared, the more it seemed to pull at the marrow of my bones, as if recognition lived inside me, long before my birth. The carvings on the wall curved in spirals and jagged lines, not forming words, but channels for thought, shaping the very air into patterns, meant to sink into the mind. The more I traced them with my eyes, the heavier my chest grew, as if the room itself wanted to write its message into my lungs. I looked again at the slab, its surface dark and slick. Even though no moisture should have survived the decades, it felt alive, almost breathing, each corner of the stone marked with stains that were not simply blood. They were layers of offerings spread through generations. Dried crusts of history, thickening like tree rings, recording each act of devotion with a permanence no one could wash away. And then I saw the nails rusted black, hammered into the stone at intervals. They were not meant for wood. They were meant for wrists and ankles. Fragments of rope still clung to them, and I realized this altar was not symbolic. It was practical. Every inch of its design was meant for restraint. Every groove in the surface channeled downward, carrying blood into bowls, carved at its base, bowls that were now empty, yet reeked of something that time itself could not erase. Around the stone lay masks carved from wood painted with ash. Their eye holes stretched wider than natural, as though to mimic faces screaming in silence. Each mask placed with careful order, forming a circle around the slab, like an audience that never left their presence, still hung in the air, as if whoever once wore them had never gone, their attention fixed forever on whatever rituals had taken place here. The weight of the room pressed deeper. The revelation undeniable. The Durnham family had not merely hidden bodies, they had conducted ceremonies, sacrifices disguised as disappearances, each generation feeding the house itself with blood, so that the covenant etched into the walls remained unbroken. And in that instant I realized something far more disturbing. This was not an ending. It was maintenance. The walls of the house were not decaying. They were preserved by what had been poured into them. This chamber was not an abandoned tomb. It was still alive, waiting for its next offering. The names whispered through the dust, like a roll call of the damned, each syllable carved into the wall with a precision that suggested pride, not shame. Sarah's hands trembled as she traced the outlines of the hidden alcoves, realizing each compartment was a carefully constructed record of innocence stolen and time preserved, like trophies for a family that had no conscience or remorse. Every diary she opened whispered the same pattern across decades. Thomas Boy, arriving on his 12th birthday, living in luxury, yet under a shadow of dread, counting days until the harvest, each entry meticulously detailing daily routines, lessons, and the creeping terror that would culminate in the final ritual. The air in the house seemed to pulse with the accumulated fear of generations of children trapped in a system designed to feed evil. Sarah felt herself becoming part of that history, as though the walls themselves were recording her presence and weighing her choices. Each step she took deeper into the mansion was a descent into moral darkness that most could never comprehend. Sarah moved methodically through the third-floor rooms, each door hiding decades of secrets. Behind faded wallpaper and beneath loose floorboards were reminders of the system that had shaped the Durnhams' lives and deaths. The portraits on the walls seemed to stare accusingly at her, as if warning her that knowledge comes at a price. She traced her fingers along the spines of diaries, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her, understanding of what the family had done. Each Thomas Boy had been carefully selected, groomed and preserved, like a living investment, a commodity for the family's longevity and power. The journals revealed that the boys were never allowed to question rules that made no sense, yet maintained the illusion of normalcy and privilege. Sarah realized she was standing in the epicenter of a ritualistic psyche. That had been repeating like clockwork for nearly a century. The basement door loomed before Sarah, like a threshold to another world. She hesitated, feeling the chill of fear and anticipation mixing in her veins. Every instinct screamed to run, yet curiosity pushed her forward. With a deep breath, she forced the locks open and descended the narrow, steep stairs. The smell hit her immediately, a mixture of chemicals, decay, and something faintly metallic. Her flashlight cut swaths through the darkness, revealing stone tables, instruments, and charts, meticulously arranged as if awaiting the arrival of a new participant. The journals displayed on shelves chronicled each Thomas boy in clinical detail, describing preparations, monitoring vital signs, and calculating the exact moment the ritual should commence. The meticulousness of it all made her stomach churn, yet she could not look away. Each entry documented life, taken yet preserved in ways that defied natural understanding. Sarah felt the weight of centuries of horror pressing down on her, yet she could not turn back. The truth demanded to be seen. Arapa's hands trembled as she picked up the oldest journal. The pages were fragile, yet the writing was precise and deliberate. Each Thomas boy was described with medical terminology, their diets, exercises, and behaviors recorded with obsessive care. The family believed that fear amplified the essence they extracted, and that careful planning was required to achieve maximum potency. The altar in the center of the basement seemed to hum with a presence Sarah could not explain. The drains carved into the stone floors glistened faintly in the flashlight beam, as if waiting for another cycle to begin. She felt a chill run down her spine, imagining the generations of boys who had come here, each one treated with kindness, then betrayed in the cruelest ways. Possible decades of stolen life and manipulated fear lay documented before her, and yet she could feel the meticulous logic behind the family's horrific methods. They had believed they were preserving the family legacy and ensuring their prosperity. Sarah turned, page after page, each entry a testament to calculated horror, and her resolve hardened. She knew that uncovering this story was no longer optional. It was her duty to reveal the truth and to honor the memory of the boys who had been stolen from the world. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows of the Durnham mansion, casting long shadows across the once grand halls. Sarah moved carefully through the rooms, photographing diaries and artifacts. She felt the weight of decades of secrets pressing down on her. Every step echoed faintly, as if the house itself whispered warnings. She reached the study where Margaret Durnham had kept her personal journal. The lock clicked open, revealing pages filled with remorse and fear. Margaret's words confessed participation in rituals she had once believed necessary, but had grown to dread. She read about the last Thomas boy who had vanished in 2011 and understood why the inheritance had been left to Sarah. It was a call for justice, a passing of responsibility to someone who could expose the horrors that had been hidden for generations. The diary revealed the intricate network of the family's influence in Millbrook, the manipulation of local officials, and the carefully maintained silence that had allowed the atrocities to continue. Unnoticed, Sarah's pulse quickened as the scope of the conspiracy unfolded before her. Every layer of the Durnham legacy of wealth, power, and control had been built on the suffering of innocent children. Sarah moved to the basement, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing the stone walls and cold floor. Each step made her stomach churn as the smell of chemicals and decay hit her. She approached the stone altar covered in dried stains and lined with channels leading to the drains. She noticed the journals displayed meticulously detailing every ritual with clinical precision. Each entry documented the arrival of a Thomas boy, the preparations made, and the anticipated harvest. The writing described methods to maximize fear and suffering, and how each ceremony extended the life of the family members. Sarah felt the weight of generations of cruelty and the enormity of the systematic abuse that had been concealed so carefully. The realization struck her that this was not random violence, but a deliberate long-term plan, passed down from one generation to the next, designed to manipulate life and death to the family's benefit. She photographed the journals, noting the dates, names, and patterns, compiling evidence that could finally expose the horrors that had haunted Millbrook for nearly a century. Sarah carefully examined the stone tables and instruments, noting the evolution of tools and techniques over decades. The charts on the walls showed anatomical studies and precise diagrams outlining procedures that combined scientific knowledge with ritualistic intent. She realized that the family had treated this like a laboratory experiment, recording every outcome and adjusting methods to improve efficiency. The basement was not only a site of murder, but also a repository of knowledge meant to ensure the continuation of the family tradition. Each set of journals corresponded to a Thomas boy, describing his arrival, his experiences, the treatments he received, and the final harvest. The entries were meticulous and unemotional, presenting the horror in a methodical manner, as if documenting science rather than murder. Sarah shivered as she understood the calculated nature of these crimes and the decades of secrecy that had allowed the Durnhams to prosper unchallenged. She felt a surge of responsibility to bring this evidence to light and honor the lives that had been stolen in the name of wealth and longevity. Sarah and Jenny carefully mapped out the basement, noting every hidden alcove, every cabinet, and every false wall. They documented each item with photographs and notes, ensuring that nothing was overlooked. The preserved clothing diaries and photographs were catalogued in chronological order, revealing the continuity of the ritual across generations. Each Thomas boy had been treated with care and luxury for exactly 1 year before the final ceremony, showing the cold precision of the Durnham method. The journals emphasized the importance of fear and compliance, indicating that psychological manipulation was as crucial as physical preparation. Sarah realized that the Durnhams had created a system where wealth, power, and intimidation ensured silence and cooperation. The two women began cross-referencing the dates from the diaries with town records, confirming a pattern of disappearances that matched the timeline in the journals. They worked late into the night, piecing together a puzzle that spanned nearly a century and threatened to engulf anyone who dared uncover the truth. Armed with the evidence, Sarah and Jenny returned to the basement for a final thorough examination. They moved slowly and methodically, using flashlights and measuring tools to map the space. Every alcove and compartment was checked for additional artifacts or hidden documentation. What they discovered deepened the horror. Some alcoves contained meticulously labeled vials filled with preserved biological samples. Each sample matched the age and identity of the boys described in the diaries. The stone altar had grooves leading to concealed containers that suggested the Durnhams had been collecting and storing material from each victim over decades. Sarah photographed everything, knowing this would be crucial evidence for the FBI. She felt a mix of revulsion and determination, knowing that revealing the full scope of the Durnham crimes was the only way to honor the victims. Their meticulous system of preservation indicated that the family believed their actions were sacred and that every detail mattered. Each discovery reinforced the systematic planning and intergenerational continuity of the ritual and its impact on the town. after documenting the basement. Sarah and Jenny presented all the evidence to the FBI. Federal agents arrived with forensic teams and legal experts to secure the mansion. The investigation expanded quickly, connecting dots between decades of disappearances and the Durnham network. Agents discovered correspondence linking other affluent families across New England who had engaged in similar rituals. The scale of the conspiracy was staggering, revealing a network that had operated for over a century. Sarah realized that the Thomas boys were only the most visible part of this intergenerational system. Many families had kept silent out of fear or complicity, and the towns that had depended economically on these families had willingly ignored the signs. Interviews with surviving Durnham associates revealed rituals, instructions, and justifications that had been handed down from one generation to the next, creating a culture where murder was ritualized and normalized. The FBI cataloged each diary, photograph, and artifact, building a comprehensive record that would be used in multiple trials and for future preventive protocols. Sarah felt a weight lift, knowing that the evidence could finally stop such atrocities and prevent history from repeating itself.